I heard the gate slam so hard it rattled the mailboxes. Then came the screech. Not a car tire. A human. And not just any human, Karen. Her short bob haircut was already frizzing in the summer humidity, and her HOA polo shirt was clinging to her like it, too, feared her wrath. She marched down the paved path like she was about to personally arrest me. She pointed at my shoes, my dog, then at me like I was a lineup of crimes stacked vertically. "You there," she shrieked, "you're trespassing. This is private HOA property, and you were not invited to walk here." I blinked. My dog even tilted his head. I gestured behind me to the front porch I had just locked moments ago. "That's my house," I said slowly. "Been living here 3 months. Karen huffed like I'd said the moon was made of cheese. "Ownership does not mean access," she barked. "We've updated the gate protocols, and you're not on the approved entry registry." She stepped forward like a mall cop discovering a clearance sale at the law store. "I'm calling security," she warned. That's when she did something bizarre. She reached into her purse, pulled out a laminated sheet with red letters that read, "Authority verified," and held it up like a badge. I almost choked laughing. My dog sneezed. The situation was absurd. But Karen wasn't done. She waved toward her porch, where her Yorkie Muffin stood on alert like a nap-deprived Marine. "Defend the perimeter, Muffin," she cried. The Yorkie barked once, then started chewing on a plastic flamingo. It was tempting to think this was just another Karen moment, a flash-in-the-pan drama that would burn itself out. But deep down I knew this was the beginning of something bigger. When I moved into the neighborhood 3 months ago, I expected nosy neighbors, maybe a few complaints about mailbox color or recycling bins left too long at the curb. What I didn't expect was being branded a criminal in my own community. I also didn't expect to be at war with a woman who ran the HOA like it was her personal dictatorship and believed clipboards gave her legal authority. I wasn't going to argue with her in the driveway like some budget court show rerun, so I did what any sane person would do. I walked away. But as I reached my front door, she shouted after me, "You'll regret disrespecting this institution. I've had people removed before. That part didn't sit right." Inside, I shut the blinds and turned on the ceiling fan, trying to cool my nerve. My dog Bailey curled up on the rug like this was just another episode in the HOA soap opera we were now starring in. I didn't even unpack the groceries. Instead, I opened the drawer in the old credenza left behind by my late uncle and pulled out the note he had taped under the bottom panel. "Keep the key. Someday you'll need it." Until now, I hadn't thought much of it. I figured it was just some sentimental goodbye to the place he left me. But something about today's madness made me think otherwise. I went out back to the shed, where I kept most of the things I hadn't gotten around to sorting since I moved in. The shed was more like a miniature museum. Tools older than I was, boxes of paperwork, and a workbench with scribbles and blueprints tacked to the walls. One metal box, locked and dusty, sat at the far end of the shelf. I opened it using the key from my uncle's ring. Inside was a brass key, heavier than a regular house key, with a symbol that looked vaguely familiar. It was the same as the one on the HOA gate. And not just that gate. I remembered seeing it on the side access to the clubhouse, the storage facility, even the mechanical panel on the neighborhood irrigation system. I held it in my hand like it was a crown jewel. The tag next to it read, "Master HOA Key. Property of founding member." My uncle had been one of the original board members, and he had never turned in his access. My mind started to spin. Why had he kept this? Why hadn't he told anyone? Was this the reason Karen had it out for me, because she knew I had some connection to the past leadership? It explained the icy behavior, the mysterious notices, the sudden gate block, but it didn't explain why she was so aggressive now. What had changed? I didn't have time to dwell. That evening, while walking Bailey, I noticed Karen hosting what she called a community safety patrol briefing in her front yard. But it wasn't about safety. It was about power. She had maps of the neighborhood, laminated complaint forms, a whistle, and even a dry erase board where she was assigning people to zones. When she saw me walking past on the sidewalk, she stopped mid-sentence. "That man," she said, pointing at me, "isn't cleared for perimeter access. I'd like to remind everyone the gate logs now track movement, and we are prioritizing transparency." I chuckled and kept walking, but my pulse quickened. Gate logs. Movement tracking. What was she up to? I knew what I had to do. I waited until midnight, when the street was quiet and only the moths danced under the porch lights. I grabbed the master key, put on a hoodie, and slipped outside. My first stop was the clubhouse gate. I inserted the key. Click. It opened without a sound. Inside, I found a secondary door I'd never noticed before, marked with a faded plaque. "Admin room, authorized personnel only." Another turn of the key. It opened, revealing dusty shelves, an old file cabinet, and something unexpected, a control panel connected to a monitor. The monitor was off, but the cabinet held folders stamped with the HOA seal and labeled with residents' names. I snapped a few photos with my phone and locked it all back up. As I stood outside, locking the gate behind me, a voice startled me. "You shouldn't be in there." I turned slowly. It was Karen. She stood across the street in a bathrobe and slippers, holding a coffee mug that said "Boss of the Block." I slipped the key into my pocket. "Just walking the dog," I said. She narrowed her eyes. "The gate logs will show otherwise." I smiled. "Then maybe you should check them. Good night, Karen." I walked back to my house, heart pounding, brain racing. This wasn't about trash cans or porch lights anymore. Karen wasn't just a busybody. She was running something bigger, something shady. But now I had the key. And soon I'd know everything. The morning sun filtered through the blinds as I sat in my kitchen, staring at the brass key on the counter. It looked innocent enough, but after last night I knew it was anything but. That key wasn't just a piece of metal, it was leverage. Proof that something deeper was buried beneath the smiling fake politeness of the HOA meetings and the pastel newsletters filled with garden tips and flagpole regulations. I wasn't paranoid. Not anymore. Karen had shown her hand when she barked at me about gate logs at midnight. No normal person checks logs in the middle of the night unless they're watching something, or someone. Whatever she was running, she'd been doing it long before I moved in. And now I had just cracked the first door. I made coffee and flipped through the photos I had taken inside the HOA admin room. Most of the documents were boring. Schedules, mailing lists, community rulebooks, but a few folders stood out. One was labeled Legacy Owners. Monitor closely. Inside were names I recognized, including my uncle's. Next to his name, in red pen, were the words Refused Compliance. Likely has key. Below that, my name had been added with the note, Inherited property. Possible access. Watch. It was surreal. I felt like I was reading an FBI file, not HOA records. The idea that my uncle had been blacklisted years ago, and that I had stepped directly into his shadow without even knowing it was unsettling. And yet, weirdly empowering. They had already decided I was trouble. Might as well live up to it. I needed more answers, and I knew exactly where to look. Back in the shed, under a tarp and a box of rusted tools, I had found blueprints. Not of the houses, but of the neighborhood's infrastructure. Gate. Back entrances. Storage units. Utility panels. And tucked into the corner of one blueprint was a faded label. Emergency Override Unit Clubhouse Level 2. I hadn't seen a second level when I went in last night, but maybe there was a stairwell or hatch I'd missed. Whatever it was worth checking out. That night, I returned to the clubhouse, this time with gloves, a flashlight, and Bailey trotting quietly behind me like my unofficial partner in crime. The master key worked again. Inside, everything was still. The place smelled like old coffee and printer toner. I scanned the back wall, checking for something I might have overlooked before. Near the vending machines, I spotted a thin vertical seam behind a coat rack. I pushed it. The panel clicked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward, not upward. So level 2 wasn't a second floor above. It was a basement. A hidden one. The air was cooler below and the stairwell was dim. I flipped on the flashlight and descended. At the bottom, a single door with a keypad blocked the way. I tried the key in the panel beside it. It clicked. I pushed the door open and entered a small, windowless room filled with blinking lights and humming equipment. In the center of the room was a large desk with 3 monitors, each displaying live feeds from various points in the neighborhood. Front porches, sidewalks, mailboxes. One camera was angled directly at my driveway. My stomach tightened. She really was watching everyone. And then I saw it. A list labeled Security Watch Priorities. My name was first. I scrolled through the system. The cameras were connected to motion sensors, storing data each time someone left or entered their house. The logs were categorized by name and timestamp. I pulled a flash drive from my pocket and copied everything I could. As the progress bar filled, I noticed something else. A folder marked Karen Only. It was password protected, but the folder name alone gave me chills. This wasn't some neighborhood safety initiative. It was control, domination, surveillance masquerading as security. And the worst part was that most residents had no clue. Suddenly, I heard something above. Footstep. The soft shuffle of slippers on linoleum. My heart jumped. I yanked the drive from the port, shut off the screen, and crept back up the stairs with Bailey pressed against my leg. At the top, I waited. No one. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe she'd sensed something. I slipped out the side gate, locked it behind me, and disappeared into the night before she could catch me. Back home, I loaded the files onto my laptop. Hours passed as I sifted through footage and logs, trying to make sense of it all. It was worse than I thought. Karen had used her system to issue violations, target families she didn't like, and even threaten contractors who refused to play by her rules. In one video, she was seen berating a gardener for planting non-approved marigolds. In another, she waved a clipboard in a teenage boy's face because he skateboarded past her mailbox. But what shocked me most was the footage of my uncle. Grainy and low-res, but unmistakable. He stood on his porch, arguing with someone off-screen, Karen, likely. Then he said something I couldn't hear, slammed the door, and that was the last clip. No follow-ups. No explanation. I sat back in my chair, exhausted. This wasn't just about some HOA president with too much free time. Karen had turned a neighborhood into a regime. And she had ousted anyone who challenged her authority. My uncle. The board. Possibly others. She had done it slowly, quietly, and efficiently. But now, thanks to that key and her own ego, I had her playbook. And she didn't know I had it. Yet. The next day, the HOA issued a notice about a mandatory compliance seminar to be held at the clubhouse. Attendance required. Fines for absence. I could barely hold back my laugh. Karen was panicking. She was rallying her loyalists. Maybe to reinforce control. Maybe to sniff out a mole. But it didn't matter. Because I had a new plan. One that would use her own system against her. I wouldn't confront her alone. I'd show everyone exactly what she'd built. And then I'd let them decide if they wanted a president or a prison warden running their neighborhood. The master key sat in my pocket as I walked Bailey past her house. Karen stood on her porch again, arms crossed, watching like a hawk in yoga pants. Her Yorkie yapped once but then retreated behind a flower pot. Karen narrowed her eyes. I smiled. "Good morning," I said. She said nothing, just tightened her grip on her mug. I kept walking, knowing she had no idea what was coming. Not yet. But soon. Very soon. By the time the sun had risen on the morning of the mandatory compliance seminar, I was already 3 steps ahead of Karen. I had copied the files, labeled every suspicious log with timestamps, and assembled a short video compilation of her worst hits, from surveillance footage of her yelling at delivery drivers to clips of her muttering threats about certain residents under her breath when she thought no one was listening. It was subtle, but damning. And once people saw it, they'd start questioning everything. But I didn't want to just play a video and call it a day. I wanted to make sure everyone saw the rot underneath the smiling facade she had built over the years. Karen had ruled with intimidation disguised as policy. I was going to tear it down with the truth, and a bit of entertainment. I spent most of the afternoon setting up. Technically, I wasn't on the official HOA seminar committee, but that didn't matter. The clubhouse's front door still opened for me with the master key, and nobody batted an eye when I carried in a projector, speakers, and a large white sheet that I pinned across the front wall like a movie screen. Karen was out, probably preparing her own speech full of fake smiles and tighter rules. Good. I wanted her to be surprised. The room filled faster than I expected. Residents filed in wearing polos and confused expressions, clearly uncertain about why their presence was mandatory. I greeted them with water bottles and snacks, generously labeled community-sponsored, and smiled like a host at a backyard barbecue. I saw families I'd only waved to from afar, seniors with clipboards, a couple of teenagers dragging their feet, and even the local handyman who'd been fined for painting his fence the wrong shade of beige. Every chair filled. Still no Karen. That was when she stormed in. Sunglasses indoors. Clipboard clutched like a holy relic. Her smile was fake and strained, the kind that never touched her eyes. She scanned the room and then locked eyes with me. I nodded. Her lips twitched. "Good evening, everyone," she said in her overly sweet tone. "I want to thank you for being responsible residents and joining this crucial update on compliance expectations. As many of you know, we are entering Phase 3 of the Community Improvement Protocol, which means enhanced monitoring, updated access standards, and a stricter adherence to approved landscaping designs." Someone coughed. Another whispered something and snickered. Karen ignored it and kept talking, launching into a dry monologue about property line clarity and holiday decoration limit. She was almost 15 minutes in when I stepped forward and quietly said, "Thank you, Karen. If you don't mind, I have a quick presentation to share that will help clarify some of the upcoming changes for the resident." Karen froze. She didn't want to let go of the spotlight. But with the crowd watching, she had no choice. "Of course," she said, taking a stiff step backward. "Just keep it brief." I connected my laptop to the projector, dimmed the lights, and hit play. The first clip showed Karen chewing out a 9-year-old for drawing chalk art too close to a sidewalk crack. The room chuckled. Then came footage of her resetting the gate access so certain residents couldn't enter after 8 p.m. unless she approved it manually. People murmured. The video moved on to her yelling at a contractor to leave and never come back, because he parked facing the wrong direction. But the real silence came when it showed her in front of her own computer, reading off names and labeling them as non-compliant risks. There were spreadsheets, surveillance notes, even printed maps marked with red dots showing which homes she considered threats to the HOA structure. She had tracked kids, seniors, dog walkers, and even a newlywed couple who put up fairy light. By the time the video ended, the room was dead silent. Karen looked like she had swallowed a bee. One woman stood up and asked if this was real. I nodded. "I got it from the HOA control room, with the master key." Karen snapped. "That's private information," she shrieked. "That's stolen property. You broke in. You're a criminal." I stayed calm. "I didn't break in. I used a key given to me by my uncle, who helped build this HOA from the ground up. The real crime is what you've done with the place since then." A man in the back stood up. "Is that why my daughter's dance group wasn't allowed to rehearse in the park? You called them a noise hazard." Another voice. "You fined me for the wrong mulch." More voices joined in. "You cut my pool access. You blacklisted my dog. You gave me 3 violations in 1 week for planting sunflowers." Karen's face turned red. She tried to shout them down, raising her voice higher and higher, but it was no use. The room had turned on her. Someone suggested a vote of no confidence. Someone else demanded an audit. In the chaos, Karen charged toward the projector and tried to rip the cables out, but she tripped over the speaker wire and fell onto a table of bottled water. The bottles exploded, soaking her head to toe. A teenager caught the whole thing on their phone. The room erupted into laughter. I leaned over and whispered, "You should have just let me walk my dog, Karen." She sputtered and scrambled to her feet. "I will not be treated like this. I am the authority here. I control the compliance board." "Not anymore," someone said. "We're voting right now." They did. Right there in the clubhouse, with soaked tables and broken projector cables all around. Karen lost by a landslide. Her position was suspended, pending investigation. An emergency committee was formed to oversee the HOA temporarily. I was nominated, but I declined. I didn't want power. I just wanted peace. The same thing everyone else had wanted before Karen decided she knew better than the community she claimed to protect. She stormed out of the building, dripping wet, muttering threats into her phone. I watched her go, then turned to face the residents still standing around, looking stunned but somehow lighter. The nightmare was over. The clubhouse felt bigger, brighter. People stayed behind, chatting like neighbors again. A little girl drew flowers on the sidewalk out front. No one stopped her. As I walked home, Bailey wagged his tail beside me. The key was still in my pocket. The HOA had been cracked wide open. But something told me it wasn't over yet. Not with Karen. Not with what I'd seen in that admin room. Because just before I'd closed the computer, I'd found one more file. A backup system. One last lock. And the name on it wasn't mine. It was hers. I didn't sleep much that night. The image of Karen storming out of the clubhouse soaking wet with her clipboard half snapped in her hand should have been enough closure, but something about that last file I saw kept gnawing at me. The folder had been marked as backup system, contingency access, and the only name tied to it was Karen's. No title, no context, just her name and a locked interface I hadn't had time to dig into. I sat at my kitchen table long after the house had gone dark, Bailey curled at my feet, the master key resting on a coaster beside my mug of now-cold tea. I knew Karen wasn't going to take her downfall lightly. People like her never do. When you strip away the illusion of control from someone obsessed with authority, they don't accept it. They prepare their next move. Morning came with a knock on my door. I opened it to find Dave, one of the few HOA members who had been skeptical of Karen even before the seminar. He was holding a manila envelope with shaky hands. "She left this on my porch last night," he said. "I think you should see it." Inside was a typed letter, unsigned, but unmistakably Karen's tone. The phrasing was dramatic and overly legalistic, full of veiled threats and references to bylaws. But the real concern was at the bottom, a mention of her retaining emergency authority under Section 8A of the original Governance Code, which apparently allowed her to activate something called Community Lockdown Protocol if she deemed the neighborhood at risk. It sounded fake, cartoonish even, but I'd seen her tech. I knew better than to laugh. I went back to the admin room in the clubhouse later that day, this time with a purpose. The temporary committee had voted to suspend Karen's access and requested I oversee cleanup of the control systems while they reviewed the surveillance policies. Nobody stopped me as I entered. The override key still worked. I sat down at the terminal and clicked into the folder labeled with her name. This time, I wasn't in a rush. I typed every guess I could think of into the password prompt, her dog's name, HOA 123, even the title, President for Life. None worked. But then I remembered something from the video I had shown during the seminar. At one point, Karen had shouted at a resident about a protocol titled Case Standard Override and claimed it was her personal system. I typed in Standard. The file opened instantly. What I saw next made my chest tighten. Karen had installed a secondary locking system across the neighborhood's smart infrastructure. Gate controls, Wi-Fi access points, sprinkler systems, even some of the electric meters. She had set up a failsafe that allowed her to shut down or isolate individual homes from community resources. One click, and she could remotely deactivate garage doors, close side entrances, or even cut off someone's access to the dog park gate. It was a digital siege engine disguised as a compliance system. She had logged dozens of test runs, each one time-stamped and labeled with her note. One entry read, "Successful test. Unit 14 locked out for 4 hours. Claimed to be error. Reversed after threat of board review." That unit was my house. I hadn't even known. I backed up the files again and alerted the committee. They were horrified, but before we could act, it was too late. That evening, the neighborhood fell into chaos. The clubhouse doors locked shut. Gate access for residents was revoked. Wi-Fi signals in several homes dropped dead. Smart thermostats froze. People were stuck inside or locked out altogether. Phones lit up. Group chats exploded. I sprinted back to the admin room, master key in hand, but the screen flashed red when I tried to log in. Karen had enabled a lockdown protocol that only she could disable. Outside, people gathered at the main gate, confused and frustrated. Some tried climbing over the fence. A few screamed into the night. I stood in the center of it all, surrounded by neighbors I barely knew, now looking to me for answers. One elderly couple told me they couldn't call their daughter because their landline was tied to the Wi-Fi. Another man said he couldn't get to his medication because his garage door wouldn't open. A young mom was in tears because her toddler was stuck in the dark after the lights cut out. Karen hadn't just made a last stand. She'd turned the neighborhood into a hostage situation. That's when I remembered something from my uncle's notes. Back in the shed, there had been a second blueprint he'd labeled failsafe routing. I hadn't looked closely before, but now it made sense. If Karen had built a digital cage, maybe my uncle had built a way out of it. I raced back to the house, tore through the shed, and unrolled the blueprint. There it was, an emergency override panel tucked inside the irrigation control hub near the north field. According to the notes, it was hardwired into the original power relay and could be used to disable all smart locks if activated in sequence. I grabbed the flashlight, the key, and my laptop, then headed out into the dark, cutting through backyards and hedges until I reached the old shed. It looked abandoned, covered in vines and faded paint, but the lock matched the design on the master key. I turned it. The door creaked open. Inside was a dusty control box with 4 switches labeled in the same handwriting I'd seen 100 times in my uncle's papers. I flipped them in order, praying I wasn't about to shut down power to the entire street. The hum of electronics died instantly. The gate lights flickered, then went dark. My phone buzzed with messages. Garage doors were opening again. Sprinklers reset. Wi-Fi signals slowly returned. I checked my connection. The admin system was no longer locked. I rushed back to the clubhouse to confirm. Karen's lockdown had been severed at the root. Within minutes, people were cheering. Neighbors hugged. Kids played in the street like it was a block party. Some residents began pulling down the HOA signage Karen had put up. No chalk art, no flags over 3 feet wide, no porch sitting after 9 p.m. It was like a spell had been broken. And in many ways, it had. As I stood outside the admin room, exhausted and dirt-streaked, Dave approached with a grin and handed me a folder. The committee had formally voted to dissolve Karen's presidency and remove all of her systems from HOA infrastructure. They wanted me to help design the new system, one built around transparency and actual community values. I hesitated but finally nodded. Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to make sure no one like her could ever do this again. That night, I buried the master key in the time capsule my uncle had built behind the clubhouse decades ago. I sealed it with a note. For future generations. If a Karen rises again, you'll know what to do. And just as I finished patting the dirt back into place, I heard a small bark behind me. Bailey wagged his tail. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past the hedges where a shadow stood, watching. Karen. She didn't say a word. Just stood there half hidden behind a hedge, arms folded, face stony. Her eyes didn't blink. Karen wasn't the kind of person to go quietly, and I had known deep down this wouldn't end with a vote and a time capsule. But even now, after everything had collapsed around her, she couldn't admit defeat. I didn't call out. I didn't ask what she wanted. I just looked at her until the silence stretched too long and she finally turned and disappeared into the dark without a single word. I stood still for another full minute, listening to the wind. Bailey stayed alert beside me, tail down. We both knew that wasn't the last we'd see of her. The next few days were a blur of cleanup and rebuilding. The emergency HOA committee held open meetings on the lawn near the clubhouse, folding chairs and lemonade replacing Karen's stiff podium and gavel. Residents who had barely spoken to each other in months were suddenly helping replant gardens, paint over faded signs, and take down surveillance hardware hidden in decorative birdhouses and fake rock. It felt like a different world. Lighter. Real. For once, people weren't living in fear of one woman's interpretation of a bylaw. I worked quietly behind the scenes. I fixed broken access panels, rewired the gate control so it could only be opened manually or by a democratic override, and documented every trace of Karen's twisted lockdown system for legal review. Some residents wanted to file charges. Others were too exhausted to care. But everyone agreed she would never be allowed to hold any authority over the neighborhood again. A public ban was issued. Her HOA credentials were revoked. And yet, every now and then, someone spotted her car creeping past the community entrance, headlights off, engine barely humming. Then came the real surprise. A letter arrived in my mailbox. It had no return address and was sealed with wax, not the kind of thing you get from a neighbor. Inside was a handwritten note in neat, looping cursive. You did well. The key was never meant to be used lightly. I'm proud of how you handled it. And remember, the HOA was only one part of the structure. Dig deeper. The letter was signed with a name I hadn't seen in a long time. My uncle's. I stared at it for a full minute, trying to process what I was reading. He'd been presumed dead. Gone without a trace. No contact, no explanation, just vanished after leaving me the house and that cryptic note. But now he was out there. Watching. Testing maybe. Or warning. I returned to the shed and went through every single box he had left behind. I flipped through files, opened drawers, pulled up floorboards. Eventually, I found a hidden compartment beneath the back wall, sealed with screws and concealed by a sheet of fake insulation. Inside was a small metal briefcase, locked but undamaged. The code was scratched into the inside of the insulation. 1979, the year he had helped found the HOA. The lock popped open with a click that felt louder than it should have. The briefcase held more than just paper. It contained photos, maps, and diagrams, not of our neighborhood but of several nearby communities, all run by different HOAs. My uncle had been documenting similar abuses of power in surrounding areas, compiling evidence of a trend far larger than I had imagined. Names were circled. Karen's was there, of course, but so were others. Presidents, treasurers, enforcement officers. A network, maybe not officially connected, but operating the same way, enforcing the same tactics, hiding behind the same bureaucracy. It made my stomach turn. He had been trying to stop it before it grew. And when he got too close, they pushed him out. Forced him into hiding. Or worse. That's why he vanished. That's why he left me the key. I took the briefcase to the emergency committee. At first, they didn't know what to make of it. But when I showed them the similarities, the overlapping policies, and the identical surveillance tools, they began to understand. This wasn't just about Karen. She wasn't unique. She was a symptom. A loud, ridiculous, and power-hungry one, but still just a piece of something bigger. The committee agreed to share the information with local authorities and to alert neighboring communities. A regional meeting was scheduled. For the first time, multiple HOA boards would sit down not to talk about lawn heights or mailboxes, but about how not to become another Karen's playground. The neighborhood kept healing. The little girl who used to get yelled at for drawing chalk art on the sidewalk now had her own mural on the community wall. The man who was fined for playing his guitar on his porch was invited to perform at the next block gathering. Bailey got his own water bowl at the park gate. Things weren't perfect, but they were human again. People laughed more, stayed outside longer, and actually looked each other in the eye. One evening, as I walked Bailey past the clubhouse, I saw someone had replaced the old HOA sign. In its place was a wooden board, hand-painted, that read, "Community First, Rules Second," and under that, a small plaque, "In honor of the man who unlocked more than just the gate." I didn't need my name on anything. I wasn't looking to be anyone's hero. I just wanted peace. But knowing my uncle was still out there, knowing the battle was bigger than I thought, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not really. I had stepped through one gate, yes, but behind it were others. Gates not made of metal or locks but of systems and silence. And if I had the tools to open them, maybe that was my responsibility now. I took one last look at the clubhouse as the sun dipped behind it, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Bailey barked softly, as if sensing something unseen. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, then looked back once more. No sign of Karen. No clipped hedges or barking Yorkie. Just the hum of cicadas and the smell of fresh grass. We kept walking, leaving the old world behind us. But in my pocket, I still carried a folded copy of my uncle's note. Not for me this time, but for whoever might come next. Because someday, somewhere, another gate will slam shut. And when it does, someone needs to be ready to unlock it. With the right key and the right truth, anyone can.